There was a very interesting article written yesterday in the Sunday New York Times review section by a gentleman by the name of Charles Yu, who wrote a book entitled How to Live Safely in a Science Fictional World. And I forget the title of the article, something like The Warmth of My iPhone, and he was sort of riffing and doing a commentary of this film of Spike Jonze's Her. And in this article yesterday, he wrote as follows, the kind of critique of technology. He said, I once loved technology deeply. Not the device itself, but I loved what was possible, that at least in theory, anything was possible on that small square screen, referring to something that many of you in this room will not even remember or know, which is a Commodore 64, which is okay, an older crowd, older than you look. He said, it didn't want to be your friend, to coddle you, to serve you. In fact, in order to speak to it, you had to learn its language. And he speaks about longing for that time when technology provided a kind of challenge to a person, as opposed to a chronic, eternal source of vindication and familiarity. In addressing the three topics that Toba gave us, or the three questions, I created a kind of artificial framework and totally dispensable framework with which to consider these issues, with particular attention to the overall question of technology, social media, etc. The three of them involve a kind of counter and counterpoint. The first one that I want to speak about is connection, and in some respect it's repair, which I'm constructing as construct. The connection piece is obvious. There is this, as I said, chronic, not only desire, but need to create a connection. Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp. The discomfort with existing in a moment that isn't somehow connected to the other. And almost a sense of fear of what it means to be lonely, alone. It's almost impossible for a person to have that moment of silence. Lonely man of faith, we thought was a reach. This is just to find a lonely man. Find someone who isn't in the process of connecting. And at first glance, we ought to think that this obsession with connection is actually a good thing for education, a good thing for the Jewish people, a good thing in terms of the questions that were posed to us. But as Mark said so well in different words, is connecting is spontaneous, it's minimal, it's temporary, it's flexible, it's ephemeral. It's a connection that does not involve commitment. Even the source of our connecting, cell phones, used to be something you had to commit to. Remember how difficult that decision was, the 2-year cell phone contract. Now it can change at whim. Gym memberships are unlasting. Even tickets now to concerts and ballets, you could choose all kinds of different ways of connecting to it that don't involve a long-term commitment, because that appears so daunting and so unfamiliar. And so, of course, this expresses itself in all the ways in which we know well from the Pew study and notions that have already been articulated so beautifully, which express itself in terms of connection without actually belonging. What does it mean to reach out and be part of a community? This connection does not necessarily in any way demand a kind of construct. Mortimer Ostra, who's a psychoanalyst who also dabbles in sociology, said about this idea of connecting. Ostra writes, ultimately, of course, we are alone, confined within our bodies and the limitations of our minds. We entertain and encourage the illusion of contact with others. Our communication, he writes, may include touch, speech, music, exchange of smiles and other facial expressions, exchange of gestures and actions, and exposure to the visible presence and the bodily warmth and the sense of others. We are literal members of our community, but he writes, in fact, we live within the limits of our own skin, our own brains. A communication of minds and metaphorically of hearts and souls is illusory. And I think Ostra is right about this chronic obsession with communication. It actually does not create a connection which has depth and breadth and spirit and life and heart. So that as the kind of response, the tikkun to this trend of connection, I'm suggesting what it requires in our job in creating syllabi and content context for education is to create this construct, which provides a meaningful way to express connections, which includes boundaries and conceptions which are articulated and clear, shared purpose, and of course the sense of what it might mean to really belong to community. What are the essential questions that we might ask from the perspective of developing curriculum in light of this obsession with connection, but the lack of knowledge or willingness to articulate a construct? Is how do we harness this desire to share? It's actually quite interesting, at least it's something very positive, the notion of people wanting to go beyond themselves. But how do we connect that thoroughly and deeply? So how do we exploit, as it were, this habituation for connection and make it mean something? How do we create a framework where Ostrov's description of what it means to connect, which is it's illusory, it's meaningless, it drops the moment it hits something else. How do we translate this into something, as Avi Shai Margalit expresses in his book, Ethic of Memory, which I'll quote again in a moment, creates a kind of thick relationship as opposed to a thin relationship? And how do we encourage the seeking of a construct as a natural and necessary partner and complement to connection? As Amos Oz and his daughter Fania Oz Salzberger write so brilliantly and beautifully, and it now seems so obviously in their short, lovely work, Jews and Words, in terms of the response from the perspective of Jewish identity, he reminds us, ours is not a bloodline, but a text line. Even if no synagogue was to be found within miles and no rabbis, someone at home would have been able to recite crumbs of Torah, crucial verses, basic formulations, and the skeleton of the story, maybe only a chant. They could still pass on to their progeny a written legacy, albeit in oral form. Even when bookless or barely literate, Jews were always texted, not to be confused with texting. And so we have, to the very core, and as was said, at the heart of our tradition, this idea of text as the construct. Text as a kind of talk therapy to this need to connect and create a response and create a narrative. Our texting is this ongoing desire and need and brilliant capacity to rewrite narratives, because we can never imagine the Jewish experience without a construct. That's what it means to write and rewrite the Jewish visions. That's what our rabbis, rabbinic era, did so brilliantly. The second framework that I'm suggesting to think about this is meaning, and its counterpoint in some respects, it's tikkun, memory. I would argue that actually I do see, and I see it in my students, the search for meaning. Meaning is back in. In some respects, that's why we're seeing quality television, in keeping with what's on trend and what's interesting for people to be watching. There's excellent television. The obsession with Breaking Bad, again for my university students, I see it. Breaking Bad is actually a very long, brilliantly written morality tale. And this wasn't lost on students, and it wasn't lost on people that were totally engrossed in the show. And shows are either the good shows that young people are interested in, either make fun of the complete lack of meaning, like New Girl, or they're actually obsessed with meaning like Breaking Bad. And so I would say that it's not that we have a shallow generation. We are actually witnessing an interest in meaning. And people who find themselves meaningful will self-declare themselves to be more interesting. The question is, what shapes this meaning? This is a meaning which is temporal, on trend, contemporary, dynamic. It's a meaning that is most often not informed by memory. This idea that we see repeated over and over again in the media, live and appreciate the moment. For Jews, we have no familiarity. What does it mean, a moment? For us, a moment lasts through time and millennia. We have no notion of moment, such an artificial construct. As Margalit says in this work that I referenced before, The Ethics of Memory, when he speaks about what is it that one must remember and how, he does this lovely job of contrasting the Platonic cave notion of memory, where somehow we're only being retaught what we once remembered, like the famous Gemara in Nida, Daf Lamed Amud Bet, that speaks about the angel coming in, touching the lips of a baby before it's born. The assumption being the baby has learned all of Torah and now is only remembering what was once taught through life. That's Plato's notion of memory. And Marguerite contrasts that to Freud. It's how somehow the difficult memories are repressed. And what do we do in Judaism? We flaunt memory. We live in memory. We see memory as inseparable from the present. We see memory as giving the present a dynamism and a vitality and a life and a romance and a reason. For us, memory imbues the meaning of the moment with poetry, with music, with art. And so the essential question I would ask in an age in which meaning seems to be something for which people are searching, but this meaning doesn't have this informed wisdom of memory, is how can we shape the search for meaning and inform of the imperative of memory? How can we teach and create in a syllabus the idea that meaning is, forgive the language, meaningless without memory, that it's shallow, it's unusable, it lacks efficacy. And in terms of Jewish identity, well, for us, memory is probably one of the most remarkable teaching tools. There was a really interesting study done at Duke University, written up as the stories that bind. And this research tells us something that as Jews we know so well, which is that it turns out that children for whom their family narratives, their family history is something that's table talk, Shabbat talk, living room talk, of the experiences of grandparents and great-grandparents. In particular, this study tells us, the oscillating narrative, the narrative that tells not only of successive former family ancestors, but also, more importantly, the failures. The children who grow up with this memory, this intimate memory of both the failings and successes of their family, are able to negotiate the failings and disappointments in life so well. Rabbi Soloveitchik teaches us that this is actually one of the goals of halakha, that halakha creates chronic moments of self-submission, which then habituate a person to negotiate the failings and disappointments in life. And I would argue, along that, memory and the idea that memory is a vital force to keep meaning alive and keep meaning honest is the Jewish response. Lastly, in this third, albeit artificial framework, which I've created for the purposes of this conference, and you are welcome to dismiss, and in keeping with the idea that I think alliteration is mitzvah number 614 of Jewish education, validation and the response to that is vidui. By vidui, I mean accountability, I mean confession, I mean self-reflection. So validation and the extent to which young people need to be validated comes as no surprise. How correct was Facebook in creating the response to validation as a like. Even in response to tragedy, when people post that something terrible has happened, liking it means that somehow you saw it and you read it and you empathize. I saw in the window of Barney's as I was walking through Manhattan on Friday, this really tremendous, very moving exhibit, but one of the most powerful pieces was a poem that ended with, I felt affirmed. It was the happiest moment of my life. And so, and our fellow panelists have said it in one way or another, we are seeking in so many ways inclusion, validation. How many people follow a Twitter account is the extent to which any given celebrity feels as if they matter. And if it didn't happen on Facebook, I think it actually didn't happen. So in what way do we respond to that? What's the tikkun? What's the response? And in what way can this seeking of validation be something that's positive for Jewish education? I would argue that, again, vidui is about reteaching and repositioning how wonderful and unpredictable and potentially exciting are the ideas of self-reflection, vulnerability, critical analysis, failure. I mentioned to Tova, and Mark, I think, saw it happen in person. It's happened to me so many times. I teach over and over using Jewish texts, of which there are so many. The idea of encountering failure. In fact, if you look at any important, significant, influential personality in Tanakh, at one moment or not, they face failure. And it's actually even exploited by the text. And the reader is blind if they don't see that, the extent to which Tanakh asks us to consider that there is no such thing as a successful leader unless that leader has negotiated some moment of success or personal failure. But I've witnessed over and over again in my own teaching, particularly with adults, which is the only cohort I am capable of teaching which does not speak well of me, that people don't like to learn and think seriously about failure. It is actually terrifying. And what the notion of vidui, what the notion of tshuva, what the notion of uttering the extent to which we have failed does to us is it encourages us to seek that unprotected ground, that it actually creates a far more interesting individual who can rest in that failure, in that disjuncture, in that disruptive moment, and come out stronger and more brilliant, as we saw in Yaakov, Avinu, and Jacob. And so the essential question that I would ask to that is how to create enough tension in our classrooms, in our curriculum, where this moment of self-reflection is worthwhile and has teeth, but at the same time doesn't shut down the student or the learner, where it feels as if it's something that we want to seek and not something that terrifies us and closes us down. To conclude, there was a wonderful work just published called Families of Faith by Vern Benston. He's done this remarkable study that shows quite thorough 4 decades of analysis of families and the extent to which they've been able to successfully create children and grandchildren who are committed to faith. And what they have found out is that much more than role modeling, much more than teaching beliefs and ideas, much more than preaching what's important and demonstrating it is something very simple. Parents who love children. They discovered that in families, and this goes across the board in religions, including our own, where there are positive relationships with parents, where children feel a natural and emotional bond to their parents, they are far more likely to continue in faith, to continue in that faith community. So I would say, in addition to these kinds of constructs, all of this needs to be wrapped up, and this is essentially what Spike Jonze is saying in his film about technology, that ultimately it comes down to seeking a kind of love, a kind of bond, responsiveness, sense of community, and with these constructs in Judaism as kind of protectors and boundaries, as Tova says, Yesh Gvul, we can create within those boundaries a meaningful, intoxicating Jewish life.